population, directly related to cost, of course, and then possibly I should have mentioned first, improving public safety, making sure our communities are safer with every step that we take, and reducing recidivism. Because of our late start, we're going to readjust our agenda just slightly. We were going to get a few presentations before we brought up our panel of experts. We're going to ask that panel to join us first due to some flight concerns, and then move on to the presentations after that. So I'd like to invite up Chuck DeVore, Terry McDonald, and Karen Tamas, please. Did I get the name right? Okay. Mr. DeVore, welcome back to the Capitol. We're very glad to see you. You are now Vice President for Policy with Texas Public Policy Foundation. Ms. McDonald, of course, is the Assistant Sheriff, soon to be acting, I believe.
No, sir. They chose the sheriff yesterday.
Oh, see what happens? You don't get to read the papers when you're busy at work. Assistant Sheriffs yet with the County of Los Angeles, and Karen Tamas is a Senior Program Associate with the Vera Institute of Justice, and we really appreciate your taking time out of your busy days to travel many miles to be with us, so thank you for that. Mr. DeVore, would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. It's a delight and unexpected privilege to be back in Sacramento testifying before people who I know personally. I looked at your full committee, Mr. Chairman, and discovered that 16 of the 18 members are folks that I worked with when I was in the State Assembly. So I don't know whether that helps me or hurts me, but here I am nevertheless. I'd like to start off by recognizing some of the work that Mr. Chairman has done with his SB 678 in 2009. This is one of the bills, of course, that I supported, and I think everyone, in fact, supported that bill. It had bipartisan, bicameral, unanimous support in both houses. The important thing about that bill is it really hits upon some of the same themes that we've been working on with Right on Crime, in that it has successfully reduced probation revocations. And I think that's the sort of thing that we need to look at when we're trying to figure out how to fine-tune or improve realignment. It certainly serves as a model for what can be done in California. As some of you may recall, I authored the section in 2007's AB 900. That was the prison construction bill. I authored the section with the late Mervyn Dimely that added 4,000 drug and alcohol treatment prison beds, and did so because of my work for 4 years on the budget subcommittee that had the budget for the corrections system in California. And I learned of California's nation-high recidivism rate at the time, and how drug and alcohol treatment was a key missing component that was causing that high recidivism rate. I was very pleased to see some recent reports, some recent research reports that seem to indicate that that program is working very well. I think I saw something the other day that indicated that it may have cut the recidivism rate for people who are addicted to substances by as much as half. So clearly, that sort of program works in reducing crime, as well as in the long run, reducing costs for the people of the state of California. A little bit about what I do today. I'm a Vice President of Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. It's America's largest state-level free market think tank. I run the 17-person policy staff at the foundation. And something that was hard for me to really understand until I moved to Austin, Texas, is that one of the big differences between the states, other than the fact that their legislature meets every other year, they're only paid $7,200 a year, they have no term limits, but they also have no caucus staff. And so as a free market nonprofit think tank, we kind of roughly fill the role of caucus staff on an equal opportunity basis for both houses and both parties. And so there's really no equivalent to what we do in Texas here in California. So that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years in Texas, and I have to admit that I love it. It allows me to continue to play around with public policy, which is my passion. Now, a bit about Right on Crime. Right on Crime is, to put it very simply, kind of a conservative approach to criminal justice reform. It grew out of a set of systemic reforms enacted in the Lone Star State in 2007, itself kind of building on a few reforms, some tentative reforms that were begun in 2005, but really kind of came into full blossom in 2007. and began to work. You started to see a decrease in taxpayer dollars. You started to see a decline in crime. In fact, the crime levels in Texas have now reached levels that have not been seen since 1968. And this is in a state that is a very, very diverse state. From a demographic standpoint, it's younger than is California and has more minorities than does California. So it's really a dynamic place. In fact, some of you may be surprised to hear that Houston, the fourth largest city in the country, surpassed New York City earlier last year as the most diverse city in America. So that's basically where Right on Crime is coming from. Now, our top-level foundational philosophies as we approach criminal justice are pretty simple. It's protecting public safety, ensuring justice, especially through restitution. We think that that is especially important. Insisting on personal responsibility, demanding accountability, right-sizing government by asking if the criminal justice system is too large and touches too many people, fiscal discipline, preserving families, and protecting free enterprise by reserving criminal law for blameworthy conduct or actions that threaten public safety. Right on Crime is active in 15 other states beyond Texas. Additionally, there are 8 states that have enacted subsets of the Right on Crime reforms. And lastly, we're actively exploring getting involved in 5 states. That would be Alaska, Florida, Idaho, Mississippi, and New Mexico. You might call my visit out here a reconnaissance. Perhaps we might look to get involved in California as well. But some of the preconditions that we put on before we get fully involved in the state are pretty steep. We have to have a pretty strong agreement between the parties, between the houses, and from the governor. And obviously it's very difficult with realignment because you've got this federal panel of judges holding a figurative gun to the head of you lawmakers. And I know personally because, of course, as a Republican Assembly member a few years back, I was party to that lawsuit against the federal takeover of our prison system. And it's very difficult to reform and keep operational a system while you're trying to balance public safety and meet the court mandates. It's tough, and I do not envy your task at all. It is extremely difficult.
As the lefty from San Francisco, I would highly encourage Right on Crime to further consider coming to California.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll run that up the flagpole and see what our top leadership decides on as well. So what has Texas done in the arena of criminal justice reform that has kind of prompted the leadership to ask me to come out today? And let's run through that very quickly because I think some of these things could be applicable to California and might be used as lessons learned given how similar the 2 states are demographically. The largest and second largest state, very diverse states. Well, Texas has had a higher than average violent crime rate. We had the second highest number of our citizens locked up behind bars. Now it's down to 5th. Just like the rest of the country, Texas underwent a prison construction binge, especially during the 90s, where you saw the number of inmates in Texas grow 278%, while the population of the state in that time only went up by 35%. And this is certainly not unique to Texas. You saw this all over the country. But in spite of Texas's reputation as this tough-on-crime state, and some of us would like to think that perhaps because of it, the lawmakers in Texas, your counterparts, have seen fit to begin to innovate in the area of criminal justice reform. These reforms have now saved the state of Texas to date some $3 billion in taxpayer outlays and have saved Texas taxpayers from having to build another 17,000 prison beds, which I think is impressive when you think of the fact that California has 60% more of the population than does Texas. In 2011, as these reforms were beginning to prove effective, the legislature approved a recommendation from Governor Rick Perry and from the foundation for which I work, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, to actually close a prison, the Sugar Land Central Unit. This saved taxpayers $10 million a year, and that's not including the value of the land that we sold by offloading the prison. Then in 2013, this last legislative session that ended in May, the legislature authorized the closure of 2 more adult prisons. So now we have 3 prisons that have closed in Texas. And again, this, while the crime rate in Texas has dropped to levels not seen since 1968, and oh, by the way, our crime rate is dropping more rapidly in Texas than is the national average. Now, part of what we do is playing off of what we believe the founders envisioned as the founding premise of America, which is that the government of America exists to ensure liberty. And that is in contrast to in other nations where security is placed more highly. The challenge, of course, with this is that you have this dynamic tension between liberty and public safety. And it's this tension that as lawmakers you have to resolve, because if you go too far in one direction, you have the characteristics of, dare I say it, a police state. And if you go too far in the other direction, you kind of have anarchy. And so that's something that really has to be balanced. Now, in Texas, I think policymakers have consciously tried to address this balance, and you saw that with the reforms that I mentioned before, kind of started in 2005 and then really got going in 2007, 9, and 11. The important thing about the start of these reforms is they actually predated the beginning of the recession by several years. So there was actually no budgetary pressure in Texas relative to during the 2009 session when you had a lot of challenges because of the plunging revenues. So these reforms actually started in advance of the recession and were done for the right reason, and oh, by the way, also to save money. If we want to go and talk about some of the specific reforms that Texas did, and we'll talk about a few specific bills, I think what matters most to California is that Texas came to the realization that through drug and alcohol treatment and through probation and through parole, where people who have encountered the criminal justice system are very carefully supervised and have immediate incremental sanctions when they go astray. So you have to have enough resources put into the local level that when somebody who's been put on probation or is out on parole, when they begin to mess up, that you don't let that bad behavior kind of mount up and mount up and mount up and then send them back to the state prison system. What you have to have is a system that immediately, just like if a child were to go to touch a hot stove, right? You don't discipline the child 3 months later after they have the 3rd-degree burns. You do it immediately. And that's a similar precept. So what you have to do is you have graduated sanctions. For example, you take away privileges, like perhaps they have to spend the weekend in the local jail, maybe they have to have a GPS bracelet, what have you. But the principle is incremental and immediate sanctions. And that combined with treatment at the local level, I think is the magic elixir that Texas has stumbled upon, because what's happened is we've been able to divert an enormous amount of nonviolent offenders from ever entering the prison system in the first place. And what we find is when we keep their families intact, when we keep them working and amongst their friends and their support group, they're far less likely to reoffend. And so the recidivism rate plunges, and the taxpayers benefit, and society is more safe. Some of the specific things that were done in Texas that I'd like to briefly go through are some of the bills that, again, may be applicable. In 2011, and again, remember, this is a biennial session, so there's a lot of activity for 5 months, you had Senate Bill 1055. This bill in Texas built on the reforms of some 6 years earlier, and it allowed counties to opt for performance incentive funding based on reducing commitments to prison of low-level offenders, while also reducing recidivism, increasing the share of probationers making victim restitution. Remember, we talked about victim restitution as an important principle, and increasing employment among probationers. House Bill 1205 created a positive incentive for probationers to pursue self-improvement by allowing judges to award time credits for good behavior, such as earning a degree, fully paying restitution, there's that restitution again, and completing drug treatment programs. House Bill 2649 incentivized state jail inmates. Now, briefly, Texas has a system that California doesn't called state jail. So they have the state prison system, they have the state jail system, and then the local jail system. So just to let you know, that it's kind of an intermediate system that is not present here in the state of California. So House Bill 2649 incentivized state jail inmates, the lowest level nonviolent offenders in the state lockup system, to complete educational, treatment, and vocational programs and exhibit good behavior. Judges can require these offenders who demonstrated such exemplary conduct to spend several months of their sentence on probation. Formerly, most state jail felons had no opportunity for probation or supervision upon release. Transitioning exemplary state jail inmates upon reentry to probation holds them accountable to an officer, directs them to find a job and housing, and requires parolees to comply with restrictions such as drug testing, curfews, and avoiding antisocial peers. The law was projected to save $49 million. Then in this last legislative session, Texas lawmakers passed and Governor Rick Perry signed an additional 3 noteworthy bills moving the reform needle even further ahead. Senate Bill 1185 authorized a pilot jail diversion program for low-level or mentally ill defendants or offenders in Harris County. This is the largest county in the state. This is the home to Houston, as I mentioned before, the most diverse city in America now. Senate Bill 1173 created split sentencing options for state jail felons, which is expected to reduce recidivism, as some state jail inmates who are now released without supervision would instead transition to probation. And finally, Senate Bill 1237 expressly authorizes victim offender conferencing for certain criminal cases. Conferencing provides greater victim satisfaction because it results in a higher rate of restitution collection, an apology, imagine that, and a sense of closure with more expedited justice. Notably, it has also been proven to reduce recidivism because many of the offenders better understand the harm that they actually committed against another individual rather than kind of the amorphous state, right? So Texas, we think, has managed to be tough on crime and also right on crime, and we're not finished yet. This is an ongoing work in progress. So some of the things that we'd like to see in the upcoming legislative session that would begin in January of next year, about a year from now, are trying to improve public safety and the cost effectiveness of the system by implementing performance-based probation funding model where funding is not tied solely to the number of probationers, but also to the outcomes. And again, that's a difficult and complex thing to design, but we're going to give it a shot. Ensuring that offense thresholds that were set in 1993 for property crimes are increased to track the inflation that has occurred in the last 22 years. So raising the dollar thresholds to account for inflation. And lastly, reducing the use of incarceration and focusing even more on rehabilitation and treatment for individuals who are charged with possession of small amounts of controlled substances if they don't have any significant prior criminal record and they pose no danger to public safety. So let's summarize these reforms that have been accomplished in Texas. Texas lawmakers have made these reforms without reducing the length of time for any sentences. Now, I know that's a particularly sensitive topic in California, where it's often been proposed to have a sentencing commission. But what we've seen around the country among the right-on-crime states is actually Texas is a little more unique in that most other states did, in fact, revisit criminal sentences. Some of them did it through a sentencing commission. Others did it through individual votes on the floor of the legislature. So Texas, though, didn't change any of the severity of any of its sentences. In fact, some of them were actually increased, even while seeing this significant decline in the population. Thank you for that. So regarding Texas's reforms and its applicability to California, as I mentioned before, you've got some challenges here because of realignment and this federal panel that is holding your feet to the fire. And that does increase the challenge for you as lawmakers, for the legislature. But there are other challenges as well, which is how do you properly incentivize counties? Because you don't want to do something where you have the unintended consequence of a county figuring out how to game the system and, for example, sending as many people as possible to the state prison system because it doesn't cost them any money, even though it's going to cost the state and the taxpayers 5, 10, or 15 times what it would cost to do treatment and supervision. Conversely, you don't want to incentivize the counties so that they could game the system where they basically count numbers but not the quality of what they're doing. So you have to very carefully design these programs so that you get the result that you want. And that, of course, would be a declining crime rate. Texas has also enacted a number of juvenile justice reforms as well that have resulted in the closure of several juvenile facilities, as well as a significant decline in juvenile crime. And again, this is all based on measurable data that has come out about why people who are young offend or reoffend. And what the data shows is that whenever a youthful offender is brought into the system and taken away from their families and their communities and their churches, and then is exposed to people who are more serious offenders, the likelihood of that person reoffending has now gone up dramatically. And you're much more likely to have a repeat customer who, as an adult, is going to be a frequent guest of the California prison system. And so the Texas reforms have really focused on the right level of supervision and punishment for youthful offenders to keep them out of the juvenile justice system whenever possible. And again, this has resulted in significant taxpayer savings, significant declines in the amount of youthful offenders, and the ability to shut down several facilities. So again, another success story. Lastly, as far as criminal justice and the economy, and this is a tough one because it touches so many different facets of what you deal with. In a recent year, we found that Texas parolees are about 3 times as likely to be holding down a job as are parolees in California. And that isn't just due to the difference in the economies between the 2 biggest states. A lot of that also has to do with things like occupational licensing, restrictions that you as the legislature put on the ability of people to earn a living because of, frankly, what I would term cartel activity. You have people who know how to hire the right lobbyists, and they'll come and they'll convince you that we need all these layers of licensing, and we have to keep the public safe, and we have to protect them from unscrupulous operators. And before you know it, you have now shrunk the labor pool that can engage in that activity. Frequently, you've now excluded people who have been touched by the criminal justice system. And what happens? You end up driving up the rates for the people who have approached you and asked you to license their profession. You really have to do what you can to kind of examine these professional licensing requirements and really dial them back a little bit so that you're not precluding someone who's a parolee coming out and, let's say, working and providing for their family. And again, that's a very difficult thing to do as policymakers. So to sum up, again, as I said before, I do not at all envy your position. You've got to balance some very powerful political interests, from the professionals who are out there every day in uniform, working in the criminal justice system, to the prison guards and the support staff in the prisons, to victims and to your constituents who rightly feel concerned about crime in your districts. And you have to balance that then with this federal court that is demanding certain things of you that are very difficult to do while you're trying to keep the system in operation. Naturally, though, given the huge importance of California around the country as a bellwether, we are all rooting for the Golden State to get this right and to push through reforms that result in savings to the taxpayer, but more importantly, a decline in the crime rate that would accelerate so that the people of the state of California are more safe, and so that the people who have been touched by the criminal justice system are more successfully reintegrated back into society to be productive, tax-paying citizens, which I'm sure the Budget Committee is significantly interested in seeing more taxpayers in the state of California. And with that, my formal remarks are concluded, Mr. Chairman, and I'd be delighted to take any questions your committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. DeVore. We're really pleased to receive your comments today. Before we throw some questions at you, we're going to establish our quorum, so if you could call the roll, please.
Leno,
Here.
Nielsen, Anderson,
Here.
Bell,
Here.
Berryhill,
Here.
Block, Corbett, Hancock, Jackson, Mitchell, Monning,
Here.
Roth,
Here.
Torres, Walters, Wright, Wyland. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Respecting your flight departure time, we're going to throw some questions at you now and move
you,
on
Mr.
to
Chairman.
our next presenters. I think you've framed the debate that we're having here in the conversation between liberty and public safety very well. And I just want to read a brief statement from the position paper that we have here from Right on Crime. With regard to public safety, it says that prisons are overused, however, when nonviolent offenders who may be safely supervised in the community are given lengthy sentences. Prisons provide diminishing returns when such offenders emerge more disposed to reoffend than when they entered prison. I think that statement says a lot, and it certainly is related to the philosophy behind the governor's leadership in bringing us to realignment. Now, the devil's in the details, of course, but clearly a lot of common ground there. And for purposes of full disclosure, then Assemblyman DeVore and I worked on a criminal justice-related bill for a number of years when we served in the Assembly together. And I always thank you for your joint authoring that bill. It had to do with allowing California farmers to be able to grow the non-drug variety of cannabis known as industrial hemp. Amazingly, when we started that about 8 years ago, it was considered very controversial. It passed off both houses' floors unanimously just last year and got signed into law. So I guess we planted a seed of sorts when we started that. I do want to, first of all, congratulate Texas on the successes that you've had in recent years, and a couple of questions come to mind, and we'll be discussing this with the LAO and with the department in a few moments. We've seen the percentage of California's general fund expenditures on corrections grow from about 3% 20-some years ago to 5% 10 years ago to now 11%. And of course, with the dual concerns of public safety and the cost to taxpayers to ensure that safety, one of the reasons I was and continue to be so supportive of realignment is that at 11% of general fund spending without any reforms before us, it could grow to 15%. The sky's the limit, and there certainly are limitations because every dollar that goes into corrections is coming from other needs that California taxpayers have. We were to see that dial redirected to close to 7% once realignment was fully implemented. We don't have that indication yet, and that will lead to some questioning of the department in a few moments. Do you know what the percentage of Texas's general fund is spent on?
It's not going to be that much, Mr. Chairman. I don't know off the top of my head because it's not considered to be as much of an issue politically in Texas as it has been here, partially because the per inmate cost to house inmates is about half of what it is in California. It's about $25,000 per year.
That would be about half.
And further, because there has been such ongoing effort to close prisons, 3 closed, not including the juvenile facilities. So it's not even on the political radar screen right now in Texas because the direction is entirely in the reform arena. And remember, the reforms were not started in Texas for the express purpose of saving money because they started before the recession hit. I think that it was just the realization that the system was broken and that it was wrong to have the second highest level of per capita incarceration in the country and that something needed to be done to fix it.
I'm glad you brought up the word political because I think if we're going to have a forthright conversation, we have to recognize that as sensitive as these issues surrounding the broader issue of public safety is always infused with politics. And you've used terms such as tough on crime, right on crime. We talk about, and our Attorney General campaigned on the concept of being smart on crime. With the reforms that you've been able to accomplish and some of the reforms that you say the state of Texas is now considering, among them performance-based funding modes based on outcomes and also drug sentencing reform. Maybe even more particular to those accomplishments with regard to reform you've already reached. Did statewide law enforcement groups fight the legislature and the governor, or did they embrace them and assist the legislature and the governor?
It was kind of a mixed bag, Mr. Chairman. You would see district attorneys, especially if they were ambitious and had political plans to perhaps move up the ladder, they'd come in and testify. I would note that a few of them have actually lost their elections subsequently because of abuse of power in their office. But you would see pockets of folks coming and just being concerned. I think some of it was, as you said earlier, the devil's in the details, and how is this going to affect my county? How is this going to affect my operation? But I think that because of historical developments in culture, you don't have the concentrated political forces in Austin that you do here in Sacramento. It's a different environment, and I think that combined with the fact that there's no term limits, even though there's just as much turnover percentage-wise, it's just in Texas you're much more likely to have people who are leading committees, though, who've been around for 15 or 20 years with a large number of freshmen as you have in this body. So I think that combination of people who've kind of been around, who are comfortable with their leadership and know their districts and are willing to take some chances, combined with special interest groups that just aren't quite as strong relative to the legislature, I think made it a little easier from a political standpoint in Texas.
And given your experience now in Texas and with your great experience you've had here under the dome of this Capitol, any further suggestions or ideas you could have for us to be able to get over some of the humps that are causing us trouble?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mr. Chairman. Let me give you some interesting data. We did an extensive statewide poll on criminal justice reform, and if your staff links up with me afterwards, I'll be happy to send it to them tomorrow when I get back home. We polled over 1,000 likely voters of both parties over the entire state of Texas in, I believe it was November of this last year, about criminal justice reform issues, because we wanted to see, Texas is ready to have all new statewide electeds in this upcoming cycle, and potentially some significant turnover from some competitive races. And so we're concerned as a foundation, how do we keep the momentum going for criminal justice reform, and how do we prevent people running for office who may not have looked at the issue to just kind of beat the tough on crime drum because they think it's going to help them win a primary and win a general. So we did the statewide poll, and what we found was that across racial and ethnic groups, across age groups, across income groups, across partisan groupings, that the support for criminal justice reform was high, but paradoxically, a plurality of the people also erroneously thought that crime rates were going up. Because, of course, that's what the media reports, right? You don't sell newspapers or get people glued to the television set by saying, today no one was murdered, right? If it bleeds, it leads. And so the media has kind of contributed to this feeling, even though it's incorrect among the public, that crime is going up, when in fact the opposite is true. And what we found, to our delight, was that even though Texans erroneously thought, a plurality of them, about 37% as I recall, that crime was going up, and something less than that it was staying the same, and a little less than that it was going down, which was the correct answer. What we found was that in spite of that, they were overwhelmingly supportive of the criminal justice reforms that we've been enacting. Now, as one might expect, there were higher levels of support in some of the urban areas and with some of the minority groups and with some of the liberal groups. But what was also interesting is among the highest levels of support were also among conservatives, and that the weakest were moderate Republican Texans. They were the most law and order, but they still, a majority of them, still backed the reforms. And so I think that as folks running for office and who are clearly enjoying your public service, I think that the bottom line suggestion that I can give you is be confident in doing the right thing and just put a little bit of effort into explaining it to your constituents.
Thank you. Senator Roth.
Sir, thank you for joining us. You know, in California, we see people cycle out of prisons, and when they do so, at least some of the time they struggle. They work diligently to get their lives back in line to support their families, but they're unable to do so, in some cases, because of the statutory obstacles to employment that you raised, and more perhaps maybe just because they have a conviction. If you've mentioned this and I missed it, I apologize. You spoke about removing statutory obstacles to employment, clearly. But has Texas taken any action to incentivize employers to hire those who have successfully rehabilitated themselves and are simply trying to do the right thing and to earn a living to support their families?
That's a great question. I'm not aware of a specific incentive for business, but there is one thing that was done in the last session or recently that was tough politically, but as I recall was done and was signed into law. And that's, where you have these registry systems where, for public safety, if someone is a sex offender or such, you know where they live. Well, there has been an effort to apply that to places of business as well. And that effort was successfully turned back. And in fact, if it was on the books, it was reversed. I'm having difficulty with my corporate memory of Texas having only lived there a little over 2 years versus California. The point, though, being that clearly making employers responsible for now reporting, if their employees have a prior, is a significant barrier to employment, and one that we successfully prevented or reversed if it was in place. And I apologize for not remembering whether we stopped it or whether we reversed it.